He didn't knock. That was the first thing Margaret noticed. The door swinging open without warning, the cold Montana wind cutting through her kitchen like a blade, and a man filling the frame who had no right to be standing there. 12 years. Not a single word. Not one letter. And now here he stood, older, worn down to something harder than the boy she remembered, with a child strapped to his back and mud caked to his boots, like he'd walked through hell to get to her door. Margaret's hand tightened around the cast iron pan on the stove. "Get out," she said. The child whimpered, and that sound, small, exhausted, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with missing one meal, cracked something open in Margaret's chest that she had spent 12 years cementing shut. If you've ever had to choose between your worst wound and someone else's need, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The winter of 1887 did not arrive gently in the Larimer Valley. It came the way most hard things come to Montana, without announcement, without mercy, and with the particular cruelty of arriving before anyone was ready. Margaret Hale had been awake since 4 that morning, not because she was a naturally early riser, though 12 years of running a failing ranch alone had trained her body to function on less sleep than most people believed possible. She was awake because the windmill had been groaning for 3 days in a way that meant it was close to giving out entirely, and she had been lying in the dark doing the arithmetic in her head. How long without water? How much it would cost to fix? How much she didn't have? Until the numbers blurred and her eyes simply refused to close anymore. She was 31 years old and felt 60-some mornings. The ranch had belonged to her late husband, Thomas Hale, before the fever took him 2 winters back. Before that it had been his father's land, and his father's before that. And the weight of all that inherited obligation pressed on Margaret in ways she couldn't always put into words. She hadn't loved Thomas the way a woman dreams of loving a man when she's young. She had respected him. She had been grateful to him. She had grieved him genuinely when he died because, whatever their marriage lacked in fire, it had contained a steady, reliable warmth that she hadn't fully appreciated until it was gone. What he'd left her was the land, the debt, and a silence so complete that some evenings she spoke aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was only her own. She was standing at the stove, her back to the door, when she heard the latch. In this part of Montana, unexpected visitors meant one of 3 things: a neighbor with trouble, a traveler who'd lost his way, or something worse. Margaret had learned not to assume charity. Her right hand moved to the handle of the cast iron skillet before she even turned around, not out of fear exactly, but out of the practical caution of a woman who had been alone long enough to know that helplessness was a choice. She turned, and the world she had carefully rebuilt around herself, brick by careful brick, over 12 years of deliberate forgetting, cracked straight down the middle. He was bigger than she remembered, not taller, but broader through the shoulders, the kind of solid that comes from years of physical labor, rather than youth. His face had aged in the way that hard-lived faces age, lines cut deep around his eyes, jaw heavier, the easy openness she remembered in him replaced by something guarded and exhausted. He had dark circles beneath gray eyes that used to remind her of mountain water, and his coat was soaked through at the shoulders from weather or crossing a creek or both. But it was what was on his back that stopped her breath. A child. Strapped with the length of rope and blanket in a makeshift carrier, head resting against the man's shoulder, a little boy no older than 2 with dark curls plastered flat against his forehead and cheeks so pale they were nearly translucent. The child was not crying. He was past crying. That particular stillness, the exhausted quiet of a small body that has run out of the energy even to protest, was something Margaret recognized in her bones, because she had seen it in injured animals and in people who had given up expecting comfort. "Margaret," the man said, his voice. God, his voice. 12 years hadn't changed that. Still low, still with that slight rasp at the edges like gravel under boot leather. It moved through her like something physical, and she hated it for doing that, hated herself more for noticing. "Elias Mercer," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You have 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't hit you with this pan." He didn't flinch. He just stood there, one hand braced against the doorframe like he needed it to hold him upright, the child still motionless on his back. "I know," he said. I know I don't have a right to be here. I know what you must think of me. I'm not asking you to forget any of it." "Good," she said, "because I won't." "I know that too." The silence between them had the density of something compressed under years of pressure. Margaret was aware of the skillet in her hand, aware of the cold air pouring through the open door, aware of the sound of her own heartbeat doing something irregular and unhelpful in her chest. "Then what exactly are you asking?" she said. Elias reached up slowly and touched the back of the child's head. It was a gesture so reflexive, so unconscious, that it clearly cost him nothing to do, which meant it was real, which meant he'd been doing it for long enough that it had become instinct. "His name is Noah," he said. "He's 2 years old. His mother died 4 months ago. We've been moving since October." He paused. "I've knocked on 7 doors since the snow started. Every one of them turned us away." Margaret looked at the boy. The boy, Noah, opened his eyes then, as if sensing he was being discussed, and looked at her with the unnerving directness that very small children sometimes have, before the world teaches them to look away. His eyes were dark, almost black. He had a small scratch on his chin that was only half healed. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "Hungry." Margaret set the pan down on the stove. She didn't say anything else for a moment. She turned back to the pot on the fire, lifted the lid, and picked up the ladle. "Close the door," she said. "You're letting all the heat out." She heard him exhale, something between relief and a sound she didn't have a name for. And then the latch clicked behind him. She did not look at him again. She focused on the pot, on the broth she'd made from the last of the bone stock, on the business of filling a small bowl. Her hands were perfectly steady. She was proud of that, and furious at herself for being proud, and furious at him for making the moment require steadiness at all. "Sit at the table," she said. "Both of you." She fed the child first. That wasn't a decision she made consciously. It was simply what happened, the bowl placed in front of Noah before Elias had even fully settled into the chair. The boy ate with the concentrated ferocity of someone who had learned not to trust that the next meal was coming. He held the spoon wrong, gripped too tight, arm rigid, but he didn't spill a drop. Margaret watched him from the corner of her eye while she cut bread and told herself she was not feeling anything in particular. Elias sat across from his son and watched the boy eat. He didn't touch his own food when she set it in front of him. He just watched Noah, one hand resting flat on the table, and his face had an expression on it that Margaret had no interest in examining too closely, because it looked like the kind of love that had been tested until it bled. "When did you get to Montana?" she finally said, not because she wanted to ask, but because the silence was becoming impossible. 3 weeks ago." He picked up his spoon, put it down again. "Was working a cattle drive out of Wyoming. Drive ended. Didn't have anything to go back to." "You have family in Illinois." Something crossed his face. "Not anymore." She waited for more. He didn't offer it. She decided not to push. Not because she was being kind, but because she didn't trust herself to stay steady if the conversation went somewhere she wasn't prepared for. "The barn's unlocked," she said. "There's room enough for sleeping if you clear the southeast corner. I've got a cot that folds." He looked up at her then. "Margaret, don't," she said. It came out sharper than she intended. "I'm not doing this for you. I need the windmill looked at before the freeze sets in all the way, and I can't afford to hire anyone. You fix the windmill and you keep the fence line on the north pasture from coming down completely, and you and the boy can sleep warm through the worst of winter. That's the arrangement." He studied her for a moment. "That's fair," he said. "It isn't kindness," she said. "I want that to be clear." "I know what it is," he said quietly. "I'm grateful for it all the same." She turned away before his gratitude could do anything to her. Noah fell asleep at the table. Not gradually, the way most children resist sleep. Just one moment he was eating, and the next his head was resting on his folded arms, bowl still half full, small chest rising and falling with the totality of a child's exhaustion. Elias rose and gathered him up with practiced ease, the boy not stirring at all, and carried him to the corner chair by the fire. Margaret stood at the dry sink, washing the bowls. "Where's his coat?" she said without turning around. A pause. "He doesn't have one. He had one. It wore through about 6 weeks ago." She kept washing. "There's a wool blanket in the chest at the foot of my bed. Take it." "We don't need—" "He needs it," she said. "I'm not arguing about this. She heard him cross to the bedroom and come back, the sound of the blanket being settled around the boy. Then silence, except for the fire and the wind and the groaning of the windmill that had been her most consistent companion for the past 3 days. "The windmill's been giving trouble?" Elias said, eventually. "Since last Tuesday." "I can look at it first thing." "Fine." She put the last bowl on the shelf. She dried her hands on the cloth hung by the stove. She turned around and found him standing by the chair, looking at his sleeping son, and the expression on his face was one she was not equipped to look at directly. So she looked at the floor instead. "There are rules," she said. He turned. "All right. You knock before you come into the house. You don't go through anything that isn't yours. You stay on your side of whatever line I draw. You don't drink. I don't have patience for it, and I won't have it around the boy." She paused. "And you don't talk to me about the past. Not until I'm ready. And I may never be ready. You need to accept that before you take the blanket and go." He held her gaze. "I accept it." She nodded once and turned back to the stove, banking the coals for the night. "There's a lantern on the peg by the barn door. The southeast corner's clear enough. Pile the extra straw if the cold comes up through the floor." She heard him lift the boy, heard the shuffle of his footsteps toward the door, heard him stop. "Margaret," he said. "Good night, Elias," she said, before he could say whatever he was about to say. Another pause. Long enough that she felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing against the walls of her kitchen. Then she heard the door open and close, and she was alone again. She stood very still for a moment, her back to the door, hands flat on the stove surface. The cast iron was still warm under her palms. Outside, the windmill groaned and then went quiet, as if even it was holding its breath. She had spent 12 years learning how to close things off, how to stop the bleed before it became a flood, how to build a life out of what was left after someone takes the best part of you away. She had thought she was finished with Elias Mercer. She had believed it completely, the way you believe something that has caused you enough pain that the alternative, that it might not be finished, is too dangerous to consider. She had been wrong. She blew out the lamp and stood in the dark, listening to the quiet creak of the barn settling in the cold outside. She did not cry. She had learned not to cry years ago, and she wasn't about to unlearn it now. But something moved through her in the dark, something old and unfinished and deeply, inconveniently alive. And she stood with it for a long moment before she moved toward the bedroom. The wool blanket was gone from the chest. She looked at the empty space where it had been for 2 years, never used, for reasons she'd never examined too closely, and then she closed the chest and went to bed. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind off the mountains. Somewhere in the barn, a child named Noah was sleeping warm for the first time in weeks, and the man who had hollowed out the best years of her youth was lying in the straw 40 feet from her door. Margaret Hale closed her eyes and made herself a promise. She would be practical. She would be guarded. She would take what this arrangement offered: labor, survival, the windmill fixed before the hard freeze, and she would give nothing back that she wasn't prepared to lose again. It was a very sensible plan. She almost believed it. The windmill was worse than Elias had let on. Margaret knew it the moment she came out at first light and found him already up on the platform, 15 feet off the frozen ground, his bare hands working the gearbox with the focused grimace of a man who has discovered a problem significantly larger than advertised. The temperature had dropped overnight to something that made her breath hang in the air like smoke, and she stood below with her coat pulled close and watched him work without saying anything because there was nothing useful to say. "How bad?" she called up. He didn't look down. "The main shaft's cracked. Not all the way through, but close enough it doesn't matter. Any hard freeze and it'll go completely. Can you fix it?" A pause. The kind that means the honest answer is complicated. "I can brace it. It'll hold through the winter if I do it right and nothing hits it. Come spring, you'll need to replace the whole assembly." "Come spring," she said, mostly to herself, because come spring was a problem that lived in a different country from the one she was currently standing in. She turned back toward the house. Noah was still sleeping. She had checked on him before coming outside, a thing she had done without deciding to, slipping into the barn and crouching down beside the folded cot to confirm the rise and fall of that small chest, just to confirm. The boy slept with his fists closed, jaw slightly set, even unconscious, carrying some tension in his small body that she recognized as learned rather than natural. Children who trusted completely slept differently. This child was saving something for emergencies, even in sleep. She went inside and put water on to boil. When Elias came down from the windmill an hour later, knuckles split and bleeding from the cold metal, she didn't comment on his hands. She put a cup of coffee on the table and a cloth beside it. He wrapped his hands without being told, stiffly, the way men do when they're more accustomed to ignoring injury than treating it. Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:30, blanket dragging on the floor behind him. Dark curls wild from sleep, looking at the room with the cautious inventory of a child who has woken in enough unfamiliar places that he checks the exits before he relaxes. His eyes found his father first, then they moved to Margaret. She was at the stove. She didn't make a fuss of looking at him, didn't turn and crouch down and talk in that high enthusiastic voice that some people used with small children as if they needed to be won over with noise. She just said, without turning around, "There's porridge. Come sit if you want some." She heard his feet on the floor, the scrape of the chair, then silence while he climbed up by himself, which took some doing and involved one near fall that he recovered from without asking for help. She set the bowl in front of him. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. "Thank you," he said, very precisely, as if the words had been practiced. "You're welcome," she said, equally precise. She felt Elias watching this exchange from across the table. She did not look at him. The days fell into a pattern the way hard days do, not gracefully, but out of necessity. Margaret had a rhythm to the ranch that had been carved out over years of solitude, and Elias slid into the edges of it carefully, the way a man who knows he's on probation moves through someone else's space. He didn't take over. He didn't offer opinions on how she'd been doing things. He looked at what needed doing and did it, and when he wasn't sure, he asked rather than assuming. That was new? The Elias she remembered had been confident to the point of carelessness, always certain he knew the right way, always slightly surprised when the world disagreed. This man was different. He thought before he spoke. He watched before he moved. Something had worn the certainty down to something quieter, and, she was reluctant to admit, more solid. He fixed the north fence line in 2 days. She had budgeted a week for it in her head, because the posts were rotted through in 4 places, and the wire had rusted nearly to breaking in the worst stretches. He came back in the evenings with his shoulders aching and mud to the knee, and ate whatever she'd left for him without comment. He always fed Noah first, always made sure the boy was warm before he thought about himself. And this pattern, the unconscious, unfailing priority of it, told Margaret more about the man he'd become than anything he could have said directly. Noah, for his part, was watching her, not in a threatening way, in the way of a child who has learned to read adults very carefully, who uses observation as a survival strategy. He watched what she did in the kitchen, watched how she moved around the animals, watched the way she held herself when she was tired versus when she was just quiet. He didn't ask her for things. He would stand nearby when he wanted something, close enough that she could see him, but not so close that he was demanding, and wait to see if she noticed. She always noticed. The second day she put an apple in front of him without him asking. He stared at it for a moment like it might be a trick, then picked it up with both hands and ate it so slowly and seriously that she had to turn away to hide her face. On the 4th day she found him standing in the doorway of the barn while she was tending to the 2 remaining horses. He watched her brush down the roan mare with the same focused attention he gave everything, and she let him watch without making a production of it. After a while she held out the brush to him. He crossed the barn floor carefully and took it. She guided his hand, just once, just the direction of the stroke, down and back, following the grain of the coat, and then stepped back. He brushed the horse with that same excessive seriousness he brought to everything, and the mare turned her head around to see what was happening and decided it was acceptable. "She likes it," Noah announced. "She does," Margaret agreed. He kept brushing. "What's her name?" "Belle." He processed this. "That's a good name," he said, with the authority of a 2-year-old who has opinions. Margaret leaned against the stall post and watched him work, and told herself this was simply practical. A child needed to be occupied. A child needed to feel useful. These were facts. They had nothing to do with the way the tight thing in her chest had loosened slightly, the way the silence of the ranch felt different with a small voice in it. It was practical. That was all. The letters came up on a Tuesday. Not intentionally, not through any planned conversation. They surfaced the way buried things surface, through accident and the particular cruelty of ordinary moments. Margaret had been going through the storage chest in the back room, pulling out supplies ahead of the full freeze, when she found the bundle. It was underneath the spare lamp oil, wrapped in oilcloth the way her mother had taught her to protect paper. A stack of envelopes, the ribbon around them faded to something that had once been blue. Letters from the years before Thomas, before the ranch, before she had understood that life was going to require more from her than she'd been warned. She had kept them because she had not been strong enough to burn them. She knew that about herself and was not proud of it. She carried them to the kitchen and set them on the table and looked at them for a long moment. Then she put them in the fire. She watched them catch and told herself it was the right thing. Practical, clean. The same efficiency she'd applied to the rest of her life for 12 years. She was still standing there when the door opened. She'd forgotten to lock it, a thing she never did, and Elias came in for the midday break. He stopped when he saw her, read something in her posture without asking, and started to retreat. "I burned your letters," she said before she'd decided to say anything. He went still. "What?" "The ones you sent, years ago." She kept her eyes on the fire. "I burned them just now." A long pause. "Margaret, I didn't—" He stopped. She heard him move to the table, heard the chair. "I didn't send you any letters." The fire cracked. A log shifted. She turned slowly. I was sitting at the table, and he looked genuinely confused in the way people look when reality has just rearranged itself under their feet. Not guilty. Not caught. Confused. "What do you mean you didn't send letters?" she said. "I mean, I didn't send them." His voice was careful. "I wanted to. I sat down to write a dozen times. But I didn't know what to say that wouldn't make things worse, and then the years went by and—" He stopped. "Whose letters did you burn?" She stared at him. "They were in your handwriting." "They were in my—" Something changed in his face. Not fast, not dramatic, a slow, cold rearrangement. "Show me one," he said. "I just burned them." "All of them?" The silence stretched. The fire was still going. Margaret felt the floor shift slightly beneath her understanding of the last 12 years, and the sensation was so disorienting that she put her hand on the back of a chair to steady herself. "They were letters from you," she said, "explaining why you left, telling me you'd met someone else, telling me not to look for you." Elias's jaw tightened. "I never wrote any of that. I read them myself." "Then someone else wrote them." His voice had gone flat and quiet, in the way voices go when something enormous is being held very deliberately still. "Someone who knew my handwriting." She looked at him. He looked at her. And the space between them, 12 years of it, 12 years of a silence she had understood as abandonment, as proof of her own inadequacy, as evidence that she had loved someone who hadn't loved her back, began to feel less like a wall and more like a door that someone had bricked over from the outside while she was standing on the wrong side of it. "My aunt," she said. The word came out strange and flat, like something read off a page rather than spoken. "She handled my correspondence that winter. I was sick," she said. Her throat closed. She said the letters had been forwarded through the county post, that she'd read them because she was worried. Elias said nothing. He didn't have to. "She never liked you," Margaret said, mostly to herself. The fire popped. "She thought you were going to leave anyway. She always thought—" She stopped, because the rest of the sentence was unbearable. "She thought she was protecting you. Not a villain from a story. Just a woman who had decided she knew better and had acted on it, and had never once in the years after said a single word." "I wrote to you," Elias said quietly. 3 letters, maybe 4. I didn't know if you got them. You didn't respond, and I figured—" He pressed his mouth together. "I figured you'd made your choice." "I never got them," she said. "I know that now." "I thought you left me." Her voice was very steady. She was proud of that, and furious at herself for being proud. "I thought you met someone and left and didn't think I was worth even a decent explanation. I left because my father called me back to Illinois. I was dying and he needed me there, and I planned to come back." He said it simply, the way people tell old truths, without drama, without asking for credit. "My father took 2 years to die, and by the time he finally did, your aunt's letters had arrived. The ones supposedly from you, explaining that you'd moved on and married and that I should stop writing." His eyes were steady on hers. "I figured at least you were settled, At least you were taken care of. Margaret sat down, not gracefully. The chair caught her and she sat, and she looked at the fire where 12 years of misunderstood evidence was turning to ash, and she felt something that was too large and too complicated to have a single name. Your wife, she said finally. Clara. His voice changed on the name, not with grief exactly, more with the weight of something already carried so long that it had changed shape. I met her in Illinois. She was kind. She didn't deserve what happened to her. He paused. She knew about you. Not the details. Just that there was someone I hadn't gotten over. Margaret looked at her hands. I'm not telling you this to make you feel responsible, he said. I'm telling you because I'm tired of half-truths. I had enough of those to last a lifetime. Your son, she said. He looks like you. He looks more like his mother around the eyes. The smallest shift in his face. She died of a lung fever, 4 months ago, like I told you. She'd been sick on and off for 2 years. I knew it was coming, and I still wasn't ready. He looked at his hands. I don't think you can be. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, wind moved against the walls, and somewhere the windmill was turning, newly braced, holding. What happened to the letters you sent me? She said. The real ones. He shook his head slowly. I don't know. Maybe they arrived and your aunt disposed of them. Maybe they never made it. He looked at the fire. Doesn't matter now, I suppose. They're as gone as these. She sat with that for a moment. 12 years. Not a punishment she'd earned. Not proof that she was forgettable. Just a woman with too much fear and too much certainty, opening mail that wasn't hers and making a decision that she had probably told herself was love. She died 6 years ago, Margaret said. My aunt. I didn't know what I was losing when she went. She paused. Now I don't know what to think. Don't think about it tonight, Elias said, which was practical advice and also, she suspected, all he had to offer. That night, after Noah was asleep, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and did not cry, because she had stopped crying years ago and was not sure she still knew how. She sat with a cup of cold coffee and went back through what she remembered of her aunt's behavior in those months. The way the woman had handled the mail with such efficiency, the careful kindness she'd offered in the immediate aftermath, the way she'd said, he's not coming back, sweetheart. Some men just aren't built for staying with such certainty that Margaret had believed her completely. She thought about Thomas Hale, who had come courting barely a year later, patient and decent, and offering stability at a moment when Margaret had needed to believe that stability was enough. She thought about the years of the marriage, not unhappy, not loveless, just quiet in the places where she had once expected something louder. She thought about Elias in Illinois, waiting for letters that her aunt had presumably burned or hidden, receiving in return a carefully forged explanation that would have sounded exactly like her. Her aunt had known her well enough. She would have gotten the cadence right. The cruelty of it wasn't in malice. That was the part that sat in Margaret's chest like a coal. It was in certainty, the absolute, unshakable belief that she was right, that she knew better, that she was doing the girl a favor. That kind of harm was the hardest to be angry at, because it didn't come from hatred. It came from love that didn't know its own limits. Margaret got up, washed the cup, put it back on the shelf. She was not going to resolve 12 years in a single evening. She was not built for the kind of forgiveness that arrives all at once. Whatever was going to happen next would happen slowly, or it wouldn't happen at all, and she had enough to deal with before she could spend energy on deciding. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the windmill turning, steady and braced, the groan gone from it. And that was something, at least. That was one thing that was less broken than it had been a week ago. The cold came down hard the following week. The real cold, the kind the old-timers in the valley called the bone freeze, the kind that split wood and cracked stone and turned water to iron overnight. Margaret had lived through enough Montana winters that she knew how to move through it, how to layer and conserve and keep the animals from suffering too badly. But this year the cold had an edge to it that suggested it wasn't planning to be reasonable. Elias and Noah moved into the back room. She made the offer in the morning, practically, while doing the breakfast dishes. The barn's going to be too cold in another few days. The back room's small, but it holds heat better. You can have it. She didn't look at him when she said it. That's your storage, he said. I'll shift the supplies. It's not a discussion, Elias. The boy can't sleep in a barn when it drops to 30 below. He was quiet for a moment. All right, thank you. I told you once already, don't thank me, just... She stopped, picked up the next dish. Just make sure he keeps his boots on inside until the floor warms up. The back room was small, barely 8 by 10, with a single window that she'd stuffed with rags against the draft, and a rope bed that had been Thomas's mother's. She put the folding cot beside it for Elias without asking where he wanted it and left them to arrange themselves. That first night with them inside the house was the strangest one yet. It wasn't that anything happened. Nothing happened. Elias put Noah to bed, and the murmur of his voice through the thin wall came to Margaret while she sat by the fire reading, low and steady, some story or some nothing, just sound offered as comfort. And the boy went to sleep with what sounded like minimal protest. Then the murmuring stopped, and the house was quiet except for the fire. But it was a different kind of quiet than the kind she'd lived in for 2 years since Thomas died. Fuller, more alive. The kind of quiet that meant people rather than absence. She sat with that for a while, not sure whether it frightened her or not. She had begun to notice things, small ones. The way Elias moved around the kitchen in the morning without bumping into her, as if he'd already mapped her habits without being told. She moved to the left, he moved to the right, no discussion needed. The way he'd started leaving firewood stacked directly beside the stove rather than at the door, because he'd noticed that was where she used it fastest. The way he'd replaced the broken door hinge on the storage room without mentioning it, so she'd discovered it accidentally and stood looking at it for a moment before she registered that it simply worked now. These were not grand gestures. They were the small frictions of shared space smoothed away so quietly she almost didn't notice. But she noticed. Noah had started bringing her things. She discovered this on the 5th day of the hard freeze. She came in from checking the livestock to find a small, smooth stone on the kitchen table. It was oval, gray-brown, with a white line running through its center. She looked at it, looked around the empty kitchen, and then heard small feet on the floor and turned to find Noah standing in the doorway with his fists shoved into his pockets, watching her with an expression of studied casualness that she recognized as the face people make when they are pretending not to care about something they care about extremely. "Did you leave this?" she asked. A very small nod. "Where did you find it?" "Under the fence, by the brown horse." He shifted his weight from foot to foot. "It's a good one." She picked it up, turned it over. "It is," she agreed. "That white line through it, that's called a vein. Means the stone cracked once and then healed back together." He thought about this. "Like a scar?" "Like a scar," she said. He came farther into the kitchen and stood beside her, looking at the stone in her hand. "I got a scar," he said, pointing to the scratch on his chin that had fully healed now to a thin pink line. "I see that," she said. "How'd you get it?" "Fell," he said simply. "Papa said I was very brave." "Were you?" He considered the question seriously. "I cried a little," he admitted, "but not a lot." "Crying a little is allowed," she said. "That's just being honest." He looked at her with those dark eyes that were still too careful and too old for his small face. "Do you cry?" he asked, with the uncalculated directness that children weaponize without knowing it. Margaret looked at the stone in her hand. "I used to," she said. "I forgot how." He seemed to accept this without judgment. "Okay," he said, and drifted back toward the other room, apparently satisfied. She stood holding the stone for a moment longer. Then she put it on the shelf above the stove, between the salt jar and the tin of matches. It stayed there. The first real argument came on a Friday evening, and it was stupid, the way real arguments usually are. Not about the actual thing, but about all the things underneath it. Elias had been down to the Calloway place, the nearest neighbor, to borrow a tool for the fence repair. He came back later than expected, and Margaret, who had not been watching the window, had been aware of precisely how late it was getting in the way you are aware of things you tell yourself you don't care about. When he came in, she said, without looking up from the pot she was stirring, "I expected you back 2 hours ago." He was pulling off his coat. "Calloway wanted to talk. His wife's been sick and he hasn't had anyone to—" "I'm not criticizing," she said, even though she was, a little. "I just would have liked to know. I didn't realize I needed to report in." The silence had a little edge in it. "You don't," she said. "But this is my ranch, and I'm responsible for what happens on it, including who's on it. If you're going to be delayed, I'd appreciate being told." He turned from hanging his coat and looked at her directly. And how was I supposed to tell you? The Callaways don't have a telegraph. I'm not suggesting telegraph, Elias. I'm suggesting that basic consideration means basic consideration. He said it quietly, not angry but with a certain weight. You want to talk about basic consideration. She put down the spoon. Don't do that. I'm not doing anything. I'm just noting that I've been on your terms for 3 weeks. Your schedule, your rules, your pace. I haven't said a word about any of it. But if I'm going to be accused of, I'm not accusing you of anything. You're annoyed that I was late. I can see it in your shoulders. My shoulders, she said. You hold tension in your shoulders when you're irritated. You always did. The room went completely still. The fact that he remembered something that small, something she'd never known he'd noticed, hit her at a strange angle. She turned back to the stove. Her shoulders, she realized, had dropped about 2 inches. I was worried, she said very quietly to the pot. That's all. I don't know what's out there in this cold, and you had the boy. Noah was here with you. She went still. He was right. Noah had been here. She hadn't been worried about Noah. She'd been worried about Elias. She picked up the spoon. Dinner's ready, she said. He crossed the kitchen and got the bowls from the shelf. He knew where they were now, had known for a week, and set the table without being asked. Noah wandered in, smelling of sleep, hair on end, and climbed into his chair and asked if there were biscuits, and was told not tonight, and accepted this philosophically. They ate. Nobody said anything for several minutes. Calloway's wife needs medicine from town, Elias said eventually. He doesn't want to make the trip in this cold with her alone on the property. I told him I'd go with him next week if the freeze breaks a little. That's a 1.5-day round trip, Margaret said. I know. Is that a problem? She looked at her bowl. I'll manage, she said. He nodded. Nothing else was said about it. After dinner, when Noah was back in bed and the kitchen was cleaned up, Elias lingered in a way that he usually didn't. Usually he excused himself at a reasonable hour, gave her back her evenings, which she had come to appreciate, and also in some complicated place she didn't examine, resented. Tonight he stood by the fire, and she was at the table with the accounts she'd been putting off, and the silence had a different quality. Not empty, not uncomfortable, just there. Did you know my letters were gone? She asked, without looking up from the ledger. At the time, did you notice I never wrote back? Yes, he said. And what did you think? I thought, a pause. I thought maybe you were angry, or maybe you'd needed time and taken it and come to a conclusion. I wrote again anyway and heard nothing. He paused again. Then your aunt's letter came, the one in your handwriting, and I believed it because it sounded like you. It had your exact cadence and everything. She knew me well, Margaret said. She did, he said, without any particular judgment. She turned a page in the ledger that she hadn't been reading. I want you to know something, she said. I'm not ready to understand what I feel about all of this. The thing with the letters, it's large and I'm not going to sort it in a week. I know that. I just want you to know that I know now, that it wasn't, that you didn't just leave. She stopped. This was harder to say than she'd expected. That changes something. I don't know exactly what yet, but it does. He stood very still by the fire. It changes it for me too, he said, knowing you didn't choose to let me go. She closed the ledger. The fire burned. The house was quiet in the way houses full of sleeping children are quiet, which is different from empty quiet, warmer and more complicated. Good night, Elias, she said. Good night, he said, and went to bed. She sat at the table for a while longer in the dark, not because she was thinking anything particular, but because the room felt different than it had 3 weeks ago, and she wasn't ready to be alone with that yet. The freeze broke on a Thursday, slowly and without any of the drama that the cold itself had arrived with. Just a morning where the temperature was only painful instead of punishing, the sky a pale washed-out blue instead of the iron gray. It had been for 2 weeks, and the sound of water moving again somewhere under the ice along the creek bed. Margaret noticed the change before she opened her eyes. The quality of the silence was different. Winter silence in the deep freeze had a particular density to it, a compression, as if the cold were pressing down on every surface and muffling the world. When it lifted, even slightly, the air had a looseness to it that she felt in her chest before she felt it on her skin. She was out to check the livestock before Elias had the fire going, which was early because he rose earlier than she expected most mornings. She found two of the chickens had not survived the worst of it, a thing she had anticipated and still felt as a specific, tired loss. She dealt with it practically and went back inside and told herself it could have been worse, which was true and also the least satisfying comfort in the English language. Elias was at the stove when she came in. Noah was sitting at the table with a piece of charcoal and the back of an old ledger page she'd given him 3 days ago when she'd noticed him drawing shapes on the condensation of the window glass with his finger. He had been covering the paper in marks ever since. Not pictures exactly, more like territories, shapes that apparently meant something to him, even if their meaning was not translatable to anyone else. "2 chickens," Margaret said, hanging up her coat. Elias looked at her. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "that's too bad," or any of the other reflexive things people say. He just nodded in the way that meant he understood the weight of it and was not going to insult her by minimizing it. "I'll check the fence line today," he said. "The thaw'll shift the posts. The northeast corner first. It was already soft before the freeze." He nodded and poured her coffee and set it on the table, not in her hand, just within reach, and went back to whatever he'd been doing at the stove. Noah looked up from his drawing and examined her face with that careful inventory she'd come to recognize. "Are you sad?" he asked. "A little," she said, which was the most honest thing she could have told him. He looked at his paper. "I drew a chicken," he said. "Before. You can have it." He found the page and held it across the table toward her. Margaret took it. The drawing was a series of confident circles with lines attached at various angles, absolutely nothing like a chicken, and also immediately identifiable as exactly that. She put it on the shelf next to the stone with the vein in it. Noah watched this and returned to his drawing satisfied, and Margaret drank her coffee and told herself this morning was the same as any other morning, which it was, mostly. Mostly. Elias came back from the Callaway place in the middle of the afternoon, later than he'd said, but this time she had known he was going and had no reason to watch the window and was therefore watching it only moderately. He came through the door with a look on his face that she read immediately as the kind of controlled neutral that people wear when they've heard something unsettling. "What happened?" she said. He took his coat off slowly. "Ran into Pete Garner at the Callaways." She knew Pete Garner. Everyone in the valley knew Pete Garner. A broad, loud man who ran the largest operation north of the river and had made a career out of being helpful in ways that always seemed to leave the helped party slightly worse off than before. She had avoided significant contact with him since Thomas died, following some instinct she'd never fully articulated. "What did he want?" she said. "To talk to me, apparently. Asked how I came to be at the Hale place. I told him." Elias pulled out a chair and sat. Not with the ease of a man who had nothing on his mind, with the deliberateness of one who was choosing his words. He was very interested in the debt situation. Margaret went still. "I didn't tell him about the debt situation. Callaway did. Not to be unkind, the man can't help talking, but Garner knew about the outstanding loan on the property, knew the amount, knew the term." His eyes met hers. "He seemed to know a good deal about your finances for someone who's not your banker." "He's on the board of the Larimer Valley Lending Company," she said slowly. "Thomas dealt with them. I've been dealing with them since Thomas died." "And how has that been going?" She sat down across from him. The fire ticked. Noah was in the back room. She could hear him moving, the specific sound of small feet on floorboards. "The loan comes due in March," she said. "The original amount plus interest. I've been making payments, but the interest rate isn't. Thomas didn't get a good rate. I was desperate when he signed it, and they knew it." She stopped. "I've been short 2 payments. They've been accommodating so far, but accommodating has limits," Elias said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Garner told me he'd spoken to you about purchasing the property, that you'd seemed open to it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees without the fire changing at all. "He told you that," she said. "He did. I have never been open to it." She said it carefully, because if she didn't say it carefully, she was going to say it in a way that frightened the child in the back room. "He approached me last spring, after Thomas had been dead about 6 months. He said he was concerned about a woman alone managing such a substantial property, and that he could offer a fair price, and I could have the house and 2 acres free and clear." She paused. I told him I appreciated his concern and that the property was not for sale. And since then? He asks every few months, through other people mostly. Or he has his foreman happen to be passing through and happen to mention what a burden the place must be. She looked at the table. I thought it was persistence. I didn't. She stopped. He's on the board. The lending board. Yes, Elias said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The shape of it assembled itself in Margaret's head without requiring much effort. The interest rate that had seemed steep but not impossible when Thomas signed. The payments that had fallen slightly behind after 2 hard seasons. The accommodating tone of the letters from the lending company that never quite offered a workable solution. And Pete Garner, broad and loud and helpful, appearing at intervals to note what a burden the place must be. He's been waiting me out, she said. I think so. For how long? I don't know, but he knew the exact figures, Margaret, down to the payment schedule. She sat with that for a long moment. The fire. The sound of Noah in the other room. The windmill turning outside, steady now, braced. What did you say to him? She said. I told him the property was in good hands and that the owners weren't interested in selling. He paused. He asked who the owners were. I said you and your husband. She looked up sharply. He met her eyes steadily. I wasn't claiming anything. I was trying to change how he saw the situation. You told him we were married. I told him the property had a husband on it. I didn't specify the details. He held her gaze. I know I overstepped. If you want me to correct it, I will. She looked away from him. Out the window, where the pale winter light was starting to soften toward evening. She thought about Pete Garner calculating her isolation with the same patience he'd calculate a land price. She thought about the loan papers in the chest under her bed, the numbers she'd been avoiding looking at directly for months. Don't correct it, she said finally. Not yet. He nodded, once. They didn't speak again about it that evening, but it sat in the room with them through dinner and after, a thing with weight and shape that had joined the household. But the following week the thaw deepened enough that the mud returned, which in Montana passed for spring optimism. Elias and Margaret rode out together to assess the fence line, she on Belle, and he on Thomas's old sorrel, who had decided after 3 weeks that Elias was acceptable, though not enthusiastically. And Noah came along wrapped in 2 coats and wedged in front of Elias in the saddle, which he treated as a matter of great personal honor. It was the first time they had been out together like that, side by side, with a specific purpose and an actual destination, moving through the land that she had run alone for 2 years. She was aware of it in the way you're aware of something that should be more significant than it currently feels. She showed him the problem areas. The northeast corner where the frost had lifted 3 posts clean out of the ground, the long run along the western boundary where the wire had been strung wrong at some point in the past and had never held as well as it should. He looked at everything carefully and asked practical questions without making her feel as though the problems were her fault, which they weren't, but which some men would have found a way to imply. Noah fell asleep in the saddle somewhere in the 3rd hour, head back against Elias's chest, snoring lightly in the way of very small children who cannot manage the indignity of sleeping silently. Elias put one arm around him without changing the conversation. You know this land, he said. I've had 2 years to learn it the hard way, she said. Thomas taught you some of it. Some. He knew the water better than I did. I had to work out the grazing patterns myself when the south pasture started showing thin. She looked out across the flat stretch to the east. It's a good piece of land. It could support twice what I'm running if I had the capital. And the debt. And the debt, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. I have some money. Not a lot. But I worked the drive and there was a bonus at the end for bringing the herd in without significant loss. He glanced at her. I could put it toward the payment. The March payment. She looked at him directly. No. Margaret, no. She said it clearly, without anger. I appreciate it, but I won't take your money. That's not the arrangement we made. The arrangement we made was before I understood the situation. It doesn't matter. The situation is mine to manage. He was quiet again. Then, it's his situation too then. If we're as settled here as I hope we might become. He looked at Noah's sleeping head against his chest. I'm not trying to own a part of your land, Margaret. I'm not trying to complicate your ownership or your rights to it. He stopped. I spent 12 years not being here. I'm trying to be useful now. She kept her eyes on the fence line ahead. Then fix the northeast corner, she said. That's more useful than money right now. He accepted that. She could tell he didn't love it, but he accepted it. They rode back with Noah still asleep between them in the saddle, and when they got to the house, Elias carried the boy inside without waking him and laid him on the bed in the back room and came back out to help her with the horses, and they worked beside each other in the easy silence of people who have found their rhythm, moving around each other without collision, and she thought this is what she had forgotten was possible, not the romance of it, not even the closeness, just this, the simple fact of another person in the work with her, fitting into the task rather than disrupting it. She did not tell him she thought that, but she held it while she worked. The smoke appeared on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into the slow thaw, and it appeared in exactly the wrong place. Margaret saw it first. She was out at the water trough, breaking the skim of ice that had reformed overnight, when she looked up to the north and saw the line of dark smoke climbing the sky over the ridge. Her first thought was a controlled burn, some rancher clearing brush. And then the wind shifted and brought the smell of it down the valley, and her body understood before her mind did, because her body had lived in this country long enough to know the difference between managed fire and the other kind. This was the other kind. She dropped the ice bar and went back to the house at a pace that was not quite running, because running would frighten Noah. Elias was at the table with his coffee when she came in. He read her face and was on his feet before she spoke. "Northern Ridge," she said. "The wind's coming south." He crossed to the window, looked. The line of smoke was visible even from here now, darker and wider than when she'd first seen it, which meant it had been burning for some time before she noticed it and had already grown past the stage where a few men with shovels could stop it. "How far to the Brennan place?" he said. 3 miles north. They'll be the first. They'll have already seen it and gone." He moved to the door, pulled his coat from the peg. "We need to decide what we're taking." She stood in the center of the kitchen and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with temperature. 11 years on this land. Thomas's mother's dishes on the shelf. The photograph of her own mother in the bedroom, the only one she had. The letters Elias had written her were already gone, burned by her own hand, which now felt like a particular cruelty of timing. But there were papers in the chest. Deed papers. Thomas's will. The documents that proved this was her land, that proved she had rights to it, that Pete Garner could not quietly arrange away. "The document chest," she said. "I'll get it." "And the photograph in the—" "Tell me where." "Bedroom. Top drawer of the dresser. It's in a brown frame." He was already moving. Noah came in from the back room in his sleep clothes, drawn by the tension the way children are drawn by things they can sense but not name. He looked at his father disappearing into the bedroom and looked at Margaret and said, with a calmness that was somehow more unsettling than crying would have been, "Is there a fire?" "Yes," she said, because she did not lie to him. "We're going to leave before it gets close." He looked at the window. She could see him processing it, that small face going through something. "Okay," he said finally, and went to get his boots. Elias came back with the document chest under one arm and the framed photograph in his hand, and she took the photograph and held it, and then put it in her coat pocket, against her chest, and took the chest from him and set it by the door. "The animals," she said. "Horses first, then the cattle. Leave the gate open on the south pasture." "They won't go far." "Far enough." He was already moving toward the barn. "Get Noah dressed. I'll have Belle ready." She dressed Noah in every layer she could get on him without losing the boy completely beneath the fabric. He didn't protest, and he didn't dawdle, which told her everything about what he had absorbed from 12 years of living in his father's hard circumstances. The boy knew how to move when moving was required. The smoke was visible from the yard now. Not just the column, the orange pulse at its base over the ridge. The fire itself still hidden by elevation, but the light of it visible in the sky. The wind had picked up in the way wind picks up when a fire draws enough air into itself to create its own weather. And that was when Margaret felt the shift from, "This is serious," to "This has its own momentum now," the recognition of something that has moved beyond human management. Elias brought Belle out and the sorrel and helped Noah up, securing the boy in front of him before Margaret had finished securing the document chest to the saddle. The cattle were already moving on their own. She could see them flowing south down the pasture in that low, anxious drift of animals that understand danger before they understand what it is. "The north barn," she said. "The lumber—" "Margaret." His voice was quiet and direct. "Leave it. There are tools in there that—" "Margaret." He looked at her steadily over the back of the sorrel. "Look at the sky." She looked. The orange at the base of the smoke column was larger than it had been 10 minutes ago. The smoke itself had changed direction slightly, which meant the wind had changed with it, which meant it was finding the draws between the ridges and running them like a corridor. She looked at the barn. She thought about the lumber, the tools, the 2 summers of collected equipment that she had not had the money to replace even once. She thought about 11 years of every physical object that proved she'd been here, that she'd built something, that the land and all its appointments were hers. She got on Belle. They moved south at a pace that was not quite desperate, but close enough, the horses feeling the change in the air and not requiring much urging. Noah sat in front of Elias with his chin up and his eyes forward and did not make a sound. Margaret had the document chest lashed to her saddle and her mother's photograph against her heart, and the smoke coming dark and serious behind them, and she rode. The Brennan family they found at the river crossing, 3 miles south. Ruth Brennan, with 2 of her children piled onto a single horse, her husband Cass walking alongside leading the 3rd horse with the other 2 children on it, and their plow horse behind. Ruth's eyes were red, and her jaw was set in a way that meant she was not going to talk about what the smoke meant for her place right now. Possibly not ever. "The Garfield family?" Margaret called to Cass. "Ahead of us. 10 minutes. He glanced at the smoke over her shoulder. "How bad does it look from the south?" "Running the draws," Elias said from beside her. "The wind changed about 40 minutes ago." Cass's face went tight. "The Pearson place," he said. "Old Howard Pearson. He won't have seen it in time if it comes down the east draw." "He's got the dog," Ruth said, meaning the old cattle dog that slept on Pearson's porch and that everyone in the valley trusted to sense trouble before it arrived. It was a thin reassurance, but they held on to it. They crossed the river and the cold water came up to the horses' knees, and Noah made a small sound of surprise at the cold but held on. On the southern bank, a gathering had already begun. 4 families, then 6, then 8, the way people in crisis find each other along the paths they share in ordinary life. Margaret counted faces. She looked for gaps, for families who weren't there yet. The Garfield family was there, all of them. The Brennans had arrived behind her. Old Howard Pearson came down the east track on his plow horse 20 minutes later with the cattle dog sitting behind him on the horse's haunches like a passenger, and the group exhaled collectively. Margaret dismounted at the river's edge and stood watching the smoke thicken over the ridge. It was moving. You could see it move, the direction of it, the way it poured over the highest points and pooled in the low places before the wind took it south again. She had a view now of what the fire was doing that she hadn't had from the ranch yard, and what it was doing was not confined to the northern ridge anymore. Elias stood beside her. Noah had been taken by Ruth Brennan, who had produced a blanket and a piece of dried apple from somewhere in her pack, and was letting the boy sit on a log with her own children and eat it, and the boy was doing so with his customary solemnity. "The cabin," Margaret said. Not a question, just the word, stated. "I don't know yet," Elias said. "It depends where the fire makes the bend. The wind is south." "Yes." "The cabin sits in a low draw." "I know." She looked at the smoke. The smoke did not have anything reassuring to tell her. She had known this place for 11 years. She knew exactly where the wind went when it came from the north, where the draws channeled it, which side of the ridge the fire would prefer. She ran the calculation without wanting to and arrived at an answer she didn't like. "It'll take the cabin," she said. Elias didn't answer, which was its own answer. She stood with that. They were safe. The river was safety. The families around her were safe. The land might burn, but they were standing on the far side of the water, and they were safe. She told herself this with the same practical logic she'd been applying to hard facts for 12 years, and it helped about as much as it usually did. "The document chest," she said. "The deed is in the chest." "It is," he confirmed. "So Garner can't, even if the cabin—" "He can't take what the fire takes," Elias said quietly. "The deed survives. Your ownership survives." She nodded once. Some tight thing in her chest loosened very slightly, not from relief, but from the specific comfort of having one thing accounted for in a moment when most things were not. Night came earlier than it should have, the smoke obscuring what was left of the afternoon light, and the families settled along the riverbank in a way that was practical rather than comfortable. Fires built, food shared without accounting, the particular democracy of collective emergency where nobody's provisions were entirely their own. Margaret sat with the Brennan children on one side and Noah on her other side, pressed against her without permission or discussion, just simply there, his solid small weight against her arm. She did not put her arm around him immediately. She waited about 30 seconds, which was as long as she could manage, and then she put her arm around him. He leaned in without looking up, without comment, with the totality of a child who has found something reliable and is not going to examine it in case the examination makes it go away. Margaret kept her arm there and looked at the smoke-stained sky and felt the photograph of her mother against her chest, and the document chest was 5 feet away leaning against a tree, and the cattle had made it south on their own, and Belle was drinking from the river 20 yards downstream. She thought about the cabin, the kitchen table, with its carved corner that Thomas had always meant to fix, the shelf above the stove with Noah's drawing and the stone with the white vein through it. 2 years of silence she'd lived inside and 12 years of hard construction before that. And the fire was going through it now or it wasn't, and she would not know until morning. Elias came and sat on her other side. Not close, enough that she knew he was there. "The sorrel spooked at the smoke," he said. "He's settled now, but I tied him upstream." "He always was nervous," she said. Thomas could barely manage him on a calm day. "He's not so bad. He just wants to know there's a plan." She almost laughed at that. "Not quite." "Don't we all?" she said. He was quiet. The fire across the ridge threw a red line against the low clouds where the smoke was thickest, and the families along the river watched it with the attention people give to things that are both terrible and visually enormous. "When I was in Illinois," Elias said after a while, "the year after my father died, I found myself working a piece of land that wasn't mine for wages and telling myself it was temporary." He stopped. "I told myself that for 5 years, that it was temporary, that something would shift and I'd be somewhere I was supposed to be." He paused. "I think I stopped believing it somewhere around the 3rd year, but I kept saying it because the alternative was unbearable," she said. "Yes." The word settled between them. The fire burned. The river moved. Noah had his eyes open against her arm, and she could feel him fighting sleep with everything he had, a battle he was going to lose inside of 10 minutes. "I'm not going to say it's fine," she said. "The cabin burning, if it burns, I won't say it's fine." "No," he agreed, "but I've rebuilt before." She looked at the red line on the clouds. "I'm still here." He turned his head and looked at her. She kept her eyes on the sky, but she felt his gaze the way you feel the warmth from a fire. Indirect, steady, real. "Yes," he said, "you are." Noah lost his battle with sleep sometime before the next hour, going boneless against Margaret's arm in the complete and immediate way of children, and she settled him more fully against her side without making it a production. Elias reached over without discussion and adjusted the blanket around the boy's shoulders, hands careful, not touching her, just adjusting the blanket, and she let him. The fire burned on the other side of the river, through the small hours of the night, and the families of the Larimer Valley sat together and watched it, and nobody said much that needed saying because most of what needed to be said was already visible in the sky. Margaret sat with Noah's weight against her arm and the photograph against her chest, and the deed in the chest 5 feet away, and she thought about what Elias had said on the ride south. Leave it. And the way she had looked at the barn and known he was right and gotten on the horse anyway. She had left it. She was still here. That was going to have to be enough for tonight, and some quiet part of her, the part that had learned to take account of what remained rather than what was lost, understood that enough was not nothing. It was in fact more than she'd had this time last year. She held on to that. She held on to Noah. And she waited for the fire to show her what it was going to leave her. The rain came before dawn. Margaret heard it before she was fully awake, the sound of it hitting the river, hitting the leaves, hitting the bare ground of the southern bank where 40 people had spent the night not quite sleeping. She opened her eyes to a sky that had shifted from the red-orange of the fire's reflection to a flat dark gray, and the smell of smoke was still everywhere, but beneath it was something else, something wet and mineral, the smell of water on scorched earth. Noah was still against her side, deeply unconscious, mouth slightly open. She had not moved in hours, unwilling to disturb him, and her left arm had gone numb sometime around midnight. She moved it carefully now, feeling the pins and needles work their way back up to her shoulder, and Noah stirred but didn't wake. Elias was awake. She could tell from the quality of his stillness. He was sitting 3 feet away, elbows on his knees, looking north, and the particular stillness of a man who is awake and thinking is different from the stillness of one who is sleeping. He had not slept much, she suspected. Maybe not at all. "It's raining," she said, quietly enough not to disturb the others. "Yes." He kept his eyes on the northern ridge. "Been coming down about 20 minutes. "Did it change direction?" He knew she meant the fire. "Hard to tell. The smoke's too thick to read it properly." He paused. "But I haven't seen the sky get any brighter, which is something." She sat up slowly, working feeling back into her arm. Around them, the riverbank was a landscape of exhausted families in various states of consciousness. The Brennan children, asleep in a pile under their mother's coat. Old Howard Pearson propped against a tree with his hat over his face. The Garfield boys stirring and whispering to each other in the way of boys who cannot help finding something exciting in almost any disaster. Cass Brennan was already on his feet, standing at the water's edge, looking north the same direction Elias was looking. "You think we can go back at first light?" he called across, low-voiced. "Depends on the rain," Elias said, "and what we find." Margaret got to her feet. Every part of her ached with the specific misery of a night spent on river ground in early spring, and she was 51 years old in her joints, if not in her years, and she did not allow herself to catalog the discomfort, because cataloging it only made it worse. She moved to the water's edge beside Elias and looked north. The smoke was still there, but it had changed character, lower, heavier, white, mixed in with the black in the way that meant water was hitting it. The rain was not a drizzle. It was the kind of solid, purposeful Montana rain that didn't stop once it started. "It'll hold," Elias said, as if he'd followed her thinking. "You don't know that." "No," he agreed, "but it's raining hard enough that I think it will." She stood beside him and watched the smoke and let herself hold, cautiously, the possibility that what remained of the cabin was still standing. "What?" They crossed back north at mid-morning, when the rain had not stopped and the smoke over the ridge had gone from column to smear to something low and scattered that no longer moved with any direction. The river was running higher than when they'd crossed the night before, the rain coming off the mountains faster than the creek could manage it. And Margaret kept Belle steady through the crossing with both hands on the reins and her eyes forward. Noah had eaten a piece of bread Ruth Brennan produced from somewhere and declared it good and asked if they were going home now and been told yes. He had accepted this with the same seriousness he accepted most information, processing it briefly, and then turning his attention to the cattle dog, who had adopted him sometime in the night and was now trotting alongside his horse with the air of a dog who has made a considered choice and is satisfied with it. The Brennan place was first on the north track. They all stopped together, without discussing it, because whatever they found at the Brennan place would tell them something about what was coming further in. It told them a great deal. The barn was gone. Not burned down gone, erased gone, the way the most intense fires leave things. Not ruins, but simply an absence where a structure used to be. The outline of the foundation visible in the blackened ground and nothing else. The north field was scorched to the soil. 3 fence lines had vanished entirely. But the house was standing, not undamaged. The north-facing wall was charred. The porch roof had partially collapsed. 2 windows were blown out by the heat. But the walls were up, and the main structure was intact, and Ruth Brennan stood in front of it, with both hands pressed flat against the scorched siding, and her forehead against her hands, and did not say anything for a long moment. Her husband put his hand on her back. She didn't move. Margaret looked at the standing house and thought, this is what it looks like. Not salvation, not tragedy. The complicated, exhausting middle ground of losing a great deal and not losing everything, which is its own kind of hard. They left the Brennans to their own reckoning and moved further north. The first sight of her property was the windmill. It was still turning. She saw it from the track, half a mile out, turning in the post-rain wind exactly as it had been turning when she left. And something loosened in her chest so quickly it almost felt like dropping. The brace Elias had built had held. The fire had come and the windmill was still turning, and she pressed her heels into Belle's sides without meaning to, and the mare moved forward. The north barn was gone. She had known it would be. It sat exposed on the high side of the property, and the fire would have taken it first. The lumber, the tools, the extra tack, and the hay she'd put up in September. All of it. The ground where it had stood was black, and the smell of it was sharp and particular, the smell of a thing that had burned hot. But the cabin was standing. She stopped Belle in the yard and looked at it for a long moment, and did not say anything. The north-facing wall had the same scorched character as the Brennan house, blackened boards, the climbing heat stain up to the eaves, and the kitchen window that faced north had cracked straight across, a clean diagonal break. The porch she'd replaced the boards on 3 summers ago was warped and black on the outer edge, but structurally intact. The windmill turned, the cabin stood. The document chest was on her saddle. She got down from the horse and walked to the door and went inside. The kitchen smelled of smoke. It was going to smell of smoke for weeks, she already knew that. But everything in it was where she had left it. The bowls on the shelf, the pot on the stove, the salt jar and the tin of matches, the stone with the white vein through it. Noah's drawing on the shelf beside it. She stood in her kitchen with the smell of smoke all around her and looked at the stone and the drawing and felt something move through her that she could not have named if someone had asked her to, something compounded of the specific gratitude of a person who expected less, and the specific grief of a person who is aware of all the things that didn't survive, somewhere else, for someone else, last night. She heard Elias in the doorway behind her. "The cabin held," he said. "Yes." "The north barn didn't." "I know." She turned. He was standing in the doorway with Noah in front of him, the boy's hand in his, and behind them she could see the black ground where the barn had been and the turning of the windmill beyond it. "I knew it wouldn't. Before we left, I knew." He nodded. "What do you need to do first?" That was the right question. Not how are you or what a relief or any of the other things that were true, but useless. What do you need to do first? "Clear the north wall," she said. "Check the structural damage. Inventory what's left and what's gone." She paused. "Make coffee." "I'll get the stove going," he said. He came in, stepping around her without fuss, setting Noah on the chair with the instruction to stay put while the adults worked. Noah arranged himself importantly on the chair and began an inventory of everything within arm's reach, which was fine and useful and occupied him. They worked through the morning methodically, the way hard work gets done, not with great energy, but with the particular steadiness of people who understand that what's in front of them needs to be gotten through regardless of how they feel about it. Elias cleared the scorched debris from the north wall's exterior, testing boards for structural integrity with the same focused attention he'd given the windmill gearbox. Margaret did the inventory, not just what was physically present, but what was functional, what would last through summer and what wouldn't. The news was mixed, the way news from disasters always is. The root cellar had survived intact, which meant the preserved food stores and the seed stock were whole. That was significant, the kind of significant that meant the difference between a hard season and a desperate one. The water supply was working, the windmill had held, the pipes hadn't frozen and cracked in the fire heat, the trough was already refilling in the rain. The horses were recovered from downstream where Cass Brennan's son had kept them overnight and brought back that morning. What was gone was the north barn and everything in it. 2 months of winter wood she'd stacked along the barn's east wall. Thomas's old workbench with every tool on it, the spare tack and the hay. 3 of the fence sections on the north perimeter. She sat at the kitchen table with the inventory in front of her and the coffee Elias had made. Too strong, the way he always made it, a thing she had stopped mentioning, and did the arithmetic. It was not good arithmetic, but it was survivable arithmetic, which was not the same thing, but was something. Cass Brennan appeared at the door at midday with 2 of his boys and Ruth's brother who'd come in from the neighboring valley when word reached him. They had tools. Not many, but some. Cass stood on the porch and looked at the north wall and said, "You held better than us." And Margaret said, "I know, and I'm sorry." And he said, "Don't be, we're still standing." And that was the whole of that conversation. They began work on the Hale North Wall that afternoon, and the Brennan barn the day after, and the fence lines the day after that. The Valley's families moving property to property in the way that communities move when there is no other option. The Garfields bringing extra lumber, old Howard Pearson, arriving with his 2 draft horses, and an offer of labor from himself and his youngest son, the general movement of people toward the work that needed doing in the way water moves toward the lowest point, not from nobility exactly, but from the practical understanding that winter was not finished and the work was not going to wait. Pete Garner appeared on the 3rd day. He came on a good horse, his foreman riding behind him, and he came in the way of men who consider their arrival a favor. Margaret saw him from the north wall where she was working alongside Cass and Elias, and felt the specific cold of recognition move through her. Not fear, something older and more controlled than fear. The thing that moves through you when you see a problem you've been aware of for a long time, moving from the background into the foreground. "Mrs. Hale," Garner said from the horse. He had a broad face under a well-kept hat, and he looked at the property the way buyers look at properties. Not at the damage, at the land. "Terrible thing, this fire. Terrible. I heard you came through better than some." "We did," she said. She did not put her tools down. He looked at Elias, who was on the north side of the wall and had straightened at the sound of the newcomer's voice. Garner's eyes moved between them with the careful calculation of a man adjusting his understanding of a situation. "This your man, then?" he said to Margaret. "This is Elias Mercer," she said. "He's been working the property." "I see." Garner glanced at his foreman, a small movement that meant something between them. "Well, I came to offer whatever assistance I can. In difficult times, neighbors ought to look after one another." "That's generous," Elias said from where he stood. He had not moved closer. He kept his voice level and moderate and his eyes on Garner with an attention that was not hostile but was not nothing. "What kind of assistance did you have in mind?" "Well, with the damage to the property," Garner looked at the north wall, the blackened ground where the barn had been. "I know the financial situation here has been complicated. If Mrs. Hale were looking to simplify things, now might be—" "She's not," Elias said. Garner looked at him, then at Margaret. "Mrs. Hale, I'm speaking to you as—" "I heard you," she said. She had put her tools down now, not because she was done with them, but because she wanted her hands free. "And Mr. Mercer is right. I'm not looking to simplify things. I'm looking to rebuild them." Garner's expression did the thing that faces do when they are maintaining friendliness over something less friendly. "Now be reasonable. The north barn is gone. The fence lines are being rebuilt," she said. "As you can see." He looked at the people working, the Brennan boys, Howard Pearson's son, 2 of the Garfield men, and she watched him recalculate. A woman alone in debt after a disaster was one thing. A woman with neighbors at her walls was another proposition, and Pete Garner was nothing if not a man who understood propositions. "Well," he said after a moment, "the offer stands if you change your mind." "It won't," she said. He touched his hat brim, a gesture that was more acknowledgement than courtesy, and turned his horse and rode out with his foreman behind him, and the yard was quiet for a moment after they left. Cass Brennan said, from the wall, without looking up from his work, "Never liked that man." "No," Margaret agreed, and picked her tools back up. She did not look at Elias, but she felt him looking at her, and whatever was in his expression she wasn't ready to see directly yet. So she kept her eyes on the boards and her hands on the tools, and worked. That evening, with the other men gone home, and Noah already down for the night, Margaret spread the loan papers on the kitchen table. She had been avoiding the full reckoning for weeks, not from denial exactly, more from the practical understanding that there was no point in staring at numbers she couldn't change. But Garner's visit had moved the timeline. A man who comes offering to help during a disaster and then pivots to a purchase offer inside of 2 minutes is not waiting for the right moment to be decent. He is waiting for the moment when your resistance is lowest. She was not going to let that moment arrive. Elias sat across from her. She had not asked him to stay. He had simply not left, and she had not sent him away, which was its own kind of asking. She laid out the papers and walked him through them without pride and without minimizing it. The original loan amount, the interest rate Thomas had agreed to, the payment history, what was owed in March. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Some men filled silence with reassurance when what was needed was listening. When she finished, he sat for a moment and then said, "Who else is on the board of the Larimer Valley Lending Company besides Garner?" 3 others. Devlin, the grain merchant, Orson Pratt, he runs the stage line, and a man named Hebert, who I've never met in person. Do any of them have reason to want Garner to have this property? She thought about it. Devlin and Garner have done business together. The others I don't know. She paused. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that a man on a lending board who is also trying to buy the properties in default has an obvious interest in making those defaults happen. He looked at the papers. The interest rate here is not standard. I've seen enough loan agreements to know what the going rate was in '85 when Thomas signed this. This is higher. Thomas was desperate. They knew it. Knowing it and engineering it are different things. He turned one of the papers toward him, read it. But if Garner had access to the board and could influence terms, I can't prove that, she said. No, but the rate is on the paper. The going rate for that year is a matter of public record. He met her eyes. The county clerk's office keeps those records, and the Territorial Banking Authority has oversight of local lending institutions. She looked at him. You're suggesting I report it. I'm suggesting that a complaint filed with the Territorial Banking Authority, citing the above market rate and the board member's conflict of interest, changes Garner's calculation significantly. A man engineering defaults to buy cheap land does not want scrutiny from the territory. That could take months. The March payment, yes, he said. The March payment is a separate problem. The two problems sat on the table between them. The kitchen was quiet. The fire was burning down, and neither of them had added wood. The money I offered before, Elias said. I know you said no. I'm not pressing it, but I want you to know it's there. I know it's there, she said. That's not an answer. I know that too. She folded one of the papers along its existing crease, a thing she'd done so many times, the crease was soft and white. If I take your money to save the property, what does that make your position here? What do you want it to make it? She looked up at him. I was watching her with the directness she'd found unsettling at first, and had come to understand was simply how he was. Not challenging, not performing, just present and waiting. I don't know yet, she said. That's honest. It's all I've got right now, Elias. The property, the loan, what happened with the letters, what you are to this place and to me. I can't resolve all of it at once. I'm not built that way. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm asking if you'll let me help. Not because it creates an obligation, not because of what was between us 12 years ago, just, he paused, because I'm here and the problem is real and I'm capable of helping with it. That's the whole of it. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire had gone down to coals and the kitchen was cooler than it should have been. You'd need to go to the county clerk, she said. I can't leave the property. I know. And the territory office is in Bozeman. That's 4 days' ride. I can do it in 3 if I push. Noah can stay here with you. He said it simply, not as a question and not as an imposition. If you're willing. She looked at the papers, then at the fire, then at the doorway to the back room where the boy was sleeping. He'll wake up and look for you, she said. Tell him I went to town on business. He understands that. He's 2. He understands more than 2, Elias said, which was true. She gathered the papers into their order and tied them with their string. Go to the county clerk first, get the documentation on the standard rates, then the banking authority. She paused. Take the loan papers. I'll keep copies. All right. She set the papers in front of him and he picked them up and looked at them for a moment and put them inside his coat. She got up and added wood to the fire because the kitchen was getting cold, and there was no practical reason not to. When she turned back, he was still sitting at the table. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Just, he stopped, looked at the table. When I knocked on those 7 doors before I got here, the 7th one, I almost didn't knock. It was dark and I was tired, and Noah had been crying for 2 hours, and I almost just kept going. She stood with the poker in her hand. I don't know what I would have done if I had, he said. Just kept going until... He didn't finish it. I'm glad I knocked. She put the poker back on its hook. You didn't knock, she said. You just opened the door. He looked up at her. A beat of silence. No, he said. I suppose I did. The corner of her mouth moved slightly. Not a smile exactly. The edge of one. She turned back to the stove and made no further comment, and he did not push it. and the kitchen settled back into the quiet of a house where people are staying rather than leaving. Elias left before first light 3 days later on Thomas's sorrel with the loan papers inside his coat and Margaret's careful written account of the payment history folded alongside them. Noah woke when he heard his father in the kitchen and came out in his blanket, and Elias crouched down and explained in the way he talked to the boy, directly, without diminishment, that he was going to town on important business, and that he would be back in 4 days or fewer, and that Margaret was here and the horses needed brushing while he was gone. Noah had considered all of this and said, "Okay, can I brush Belle first?" "Yes," Elias said. "Okay." Noah had looked at his father for a moment, then leaned forward and put his head briefly against Elias's shoulder, a gesture so like the one Elias made with him constantly, that unconscious leaning in, that it clearly came straight from the boy's understanding of what comfort looked like. "Come back," he said, very matter of fact. "I will," Elias said. He held the boy a moment and then set him back on his feet. "Go back to sleep for a bit." "No," Noah said, and climbed into the kitchen chair. Elias stood. Margaret was at the stove. He looked at her across the kitchen and she said, "Ride safe," which was what people said in this country instead of other things, and he said, "I will." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him and the sound of the horse moving out of the yard coming back through the walls. Noah sat at the table in his blanket and looked at the place where his father had been standing. "He'll come back," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. "He always does," Noah said, with the certainty of someone who has tested the proposition. She thought about Elias on 7 doorsteps, about the letters that didn't arrive, about a man in Illinois who had believed she'd let him go and had gone on anyway, built what could be built from what was available, carried his son across a frozen territory to a door he was not sure would open. "Yes," she said. "He does." She put the porridge on. Noah watched her from the chair with his chin on the table edge and asked if they could brush Belle after breakfast, and she said yes. Outside, the windmill turned in the early morning air, steady and braced, the groan gone from it for good. Across the yard, the ground where the north barn had been was still black under the thin spring mud, and beyond it, the fence Elias had been building back post by post before he left was half finished against the pale sky. It needed to be finished before the cattle came back to the north pasture. She would have to finish it herself, with whoever she could borrow from the Brennans and the Garfields. She would do that. She would brush Belle with Noah and finish the fence and manage the property and wait for Elias to come back from Bozeman with whatever he found in the territorial banking records. She would handle what was in front of her. That was the whole of what she could do, and she had learned, over 11 years of doing exactly that it was generally enough. Noah fell asleep again in the chair, head on his arms, bowl half empty, the same way he'd fallen asleep that first night when she hadn't known his name yet. And the only thing she'd understood about him was the particular exhaustion of a child who had stopped expecting comfort. She put the stone with the white vein in his line of sight for when he woke up, because it was his favorite thing on the shelf and she knew it, and then she went to start the day. Elias came back on the 4th day, not the 3rd. Margaret knew before she saw him that something had happened. Not disaster, not failure, but something more complicated than a simple errand completed. She had learned to read the sound of the sorrel's hooves on the track, the particular rhythm of how the horse moved when it was being pushed versus when the rider had settled into something that could wait. This was neither. This was a man arriving with news that needed to be delivered carefully. She was at the fence line when he rode in. The northeast corner section she had been rebuilding with Cass Brennan's oldest boy, helping 2 days of the 4 while Elias was gone. She had gotten further than she expected. The boy was strong and worked without complaint and had his father's quality of doing what needed doing without narrating it. She put down the wire stretcher and walked back toward the yard. Elias dismounted and led the sorrel to the trough and let him drink before he said anything, which told her the news was significant enough that he wanted to deliver it once, properly, rather than in pieces. She waited. She had gotten better at waiting over these weeks. Not comfortable with it, but less resistant. Waiting was not the same as doing nothing. Sometimes it was the only useful thing available. "I found what we needed," he said finally. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document, then another, then a third. Not the originals, copies, carefully made in the formal hand of a county clerk. The standard lending rate in 1885 for agricultural property in this territory was between 6 and 8%. Thomas's loan is at 11 3/4. She had known the rate was high. Seeing it stated against the standard range in black ink on official paper was different from knowing it. The specific documented wrongness of it moved through her like something cold. Garner's position on the board is also a matter of public record, Elias continued. The Territorial Banking Authority has a conflict of interest provision. A board member may not have financial interest in properties held by borrowers of that institution. It's written policy, adopted in '83. He met her eyes. He's been in violation of it every time he approached you about buying the property. Can they act on it? They already are. He produced a fourth document, this one with the seal of the Territorial Banking Authority at the top. I filed a formal complaint while I was in Bozeman. The investigator I spoke with, he paused. He was not surprised. That's the part that matters. He was not surprised, which means Garner has been on their periphery before. Margaret took the documents and read them slowly and carefully, the way she read everything that mattered. The sorrel finished drinking and stood patiently, and Noah, who had appeared from inside the house at the sound of his father's horse, stood beside the animal with one hand on its neck and waited with the particular patience of a child who understands that adult conversations sometimes need to finish before they can be interrupted. When she looked up, Elias was watching her. "What does this do to the March payment?" she said. "The authority has the power to mandate a rate review. If they find the rate improperly set, and they will, it's documented, they can require the loan to be reissued at the correct rate. That changes what's owed. It changes the payment schedule." He paused. "It doesn't eliminate the debt, but it makes it manageable instead of designed to fail." She looked at the seal on the territorial document. The word complaint in formal script. 12 years of someone else's calculations. Her aunt's, Garner's, the lending board's. And here was the first piece of paper in all that time that moved in her direction rather than against her. "How long will the review take?" she said. "Months? Could be spring, could be summer." He said it directly, not trying to soften it. "In the meantime, the March payment is still due as written." "I know." "My money?" "I know," she said again. Different emphasis. She folded the documents along their creases. "Let me think on it tonight." He nodded and didn't push it, and she was grateful for that, for the particular restraint of a man who has learned the difference between persistence and pressure. Noah came across the yard then, having decided the adult conversation had concluded, and went directly to his father's side and said, "I brushed Belle every day." "Every day?" "Every day," Noah confirmed. "She likes it a lot." "I know she does." Elias put a hand on the boy's head. "Did Margaret show you how to do the legs?" "She showed me," Noah said. "I was very careful." Elias looked at Margaret over the boy's head. Something in his face that was quieter than gratitude, deeper than it, less performed. She turned back toward the fence line. "There's stew on," she said. "Come in when you're ready." She went inside and stood at the stove and let the conversation settle around her the way decisions settle. Slowly, through the body first and the mind after. Shab. She told him yes that night. Not about the money first, about something else. Noah was asleep, and the kitchen was the particular quiet of a house where a child's breathing can be heard through a thin wall, and she was at the table with the territorial documents and the loan papers arranged side by side, and Elias was at the stove with the last of the coffee when she said, "I want to talk about what you told Garner." He turned. "What I told him? That there was a husband on the property." She kept her eyes on the papers. "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks." A pause. He came to the table and sat, and he did it carefully, the way you approach a thing that could go in multiple directions. "I overstepped," he said. "I told you I knew that." "You did?" She looked up. "I'm not angry about it. I'm trying to tell you something, and I need you to let me say it without interrupting." He folded his hands on the table. "All right." She looked at him for a moment. This man who was not the boy she remembered, who had been shaped by 12 years of his own hard weather into something more difficult and more real than youth could have produced, who woke early and made coffee too strong and fixed things without being asked and talked to his son like the boy was a full person worth explaining the world to, who had sat with her on a riverbank while the valley burned and not said a single useless thing. "I don't know what I feel," she said. "I want to say that first. I'm I'm not a person who resolves things quickly. You know that about me. Or you knew it once. I remember, he said. What was between us when we were young? I can't get back there. I'm not the same person, and neither are you, and I'm not going to pretend that the years didn't happen. She stopped. But what's here now, between us, in this kitchen? I don't know what to call it, but it's real. And I'm not interested in pretending it isn't. He said nothing. She had asked him not to interrupt. Noah? She stopped again because what she wanted to say about Noah was harder to articulate than the rest. He left a stone on my table 3 weeks ago. He said it was a good one. She paused. It's still on the shelf. I don't think I can explain to you what it means that it's still on the shelf, except to say that I stopped putting things on that shelf when Thomas died because there didn't seem to be any point. The kitchen was very still. I'm not asking you to prove anything, she said. You've been proving things for 4 months by just being here and doing the work and not requiring me to be grateful for it. That's not nothing, Elias. That's the kind of thing I know how to trust. She looked at the documents. I'm not ready to call us married. I don't know if I'll ever want the formality of it. But I want you to stay. Not as hired help, not as someone sleeping in the back room because it's practical. I want you to stay because this is where you belong, and because Noah belongs here, and because… She stopped. Because I don't want to find out what this place feels like when you leave again. He sat across from her and said nothing for a moment, and she felt the silence the way you feel held breath, full, compressed, waiting. I'm not going to leave, he said. I know you believe that. I know the difference between believing something and knowing it, he said. I believed a lot of things at 22. I know this. She looked at him. Then stay, she said. That's what I'm saying. Stay. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. Not of course, or I've been hoping, or any of the things that would have made the moment into a performance. Just yes. Simple and direct and final. She nodded once, picked up the documents, and said, About your money. I'll take the loan amount needed for March. I want it treated as a debt between us. I'll keep account of it and pay it back as the property earns. You don't have to do it that way. I know I don't. I want to. She set the papers down. I need it to be clean between us. If I take it as a gift, I'll feel like I owe you something I can't quantify, and that will eat at me. If I take it as a debt, I'll know exactly what I owe, and I can pay it, and it'll be done. He looked at her for a moment. You're the most stubborn person I've ever known, he said, but without any edge to it, almost affectionate, the way you say true things about someone you know completely. I'm aware, she said. All right, he said. We'll do it your way. She put the documents away and they sat for a while in the quiet without filling it, and that was its own kind of answer. That the quiet between them had become comfortable without either of them noticing exactly when it happened. The Territorial Banking Authority completed their preliminary review in late April, faster than Elias had expected, and the letter that arrived from Bozeman carried language that Margaret read 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. The complaint had been substantiated. The interest rate on the Hale property loan had been determined to fall outside the permitted range for agricultural lending in the territory. The loan was being mandated for renegotiation at a corrected rate. Furthermore, the investigation into the Larimer Valley Lending Company's board practices had been expanded in scope, which was bureaucratic language for there was more to find, and they were finding it. Pete Garner's name was not in the letter. But the letter was from the authority that oversaw him, and the expansion of the investigation was its own sentence. Margaret folded the letter and put it in the document chest and went out to find Elias. He was at the new north fence, which had been completed 10 days ago. Not by hired labor, not by one man working alone, but by the collective effort of the Larimer Valley's families who had been coming and going since the fire in the particular way that communities rebuild. Not from obligation, not from charity, but from the understanding that what burned one property could burn another, and that the currency of mutual labor was the only one that held value in this country when the real currency ran short. Cass Brennan's boys had put up 20 fence posts. Howard Pearson's son had strung the wire on the longest western run. The Garfield men had rebuilt the framework of the North Barns replacement, smaller than the original but sound, and Margaret and Ruth Brennan had worked side by side on the interior finishing while their men handled the heavy timber. And Ruth had told her 3 things about her marriage during those 2 days that Margaret would carry with her privately and never repeat. And Margaret had told Ruth 1 thing about hers, and that exchange, Those four things, unwitnessed by anyone else, had made them something closer than neighbors. Elias looked up when she came across the field. He read her face the way he'd learned to read it. Not perfectly, she was not an easy face to read, but well enough to know that what she was carrying was good news rather than bad. She handed him the letter. He read it, and she watched his face, and what moved across it was not triumph. She would have been disappointed by triumph. It was something quieter. The specific relief of a person who has done the necessary thing and found that it worked, which is not the same as celebration and is in some ways more satisfying. The expansion clause, he said. Yes. That's not about our loan anymore. No, she said. I think there are other properties. I think we weren't the only ones. He folded the letter and handed it back. Garner won't approach you again. I know. And the March payment is reconciled. The corrected amount is in the letter. With your money and the corrected rate, we're current. She tucked the letter into her coat. We're current, Elias. He looked at her for a moment. Then at the fence line, the new post solid in the spring ground, the wire running clean and tight into the distance. That's something, he said. That's a great deal, she said. They stood side by side looking at the fence, which was both a fence and not a fence. It was the work of a dozen families, the physical evidence of what happens when people show up for each other without counting the hours. And she felt the weight of it, not as debt, but as the kind of belonging you can only earn by staying somewhere long enough to be needed. May came in with it the first real warmth, the kind that stays after the sun goes down rather than disappearing the moment the light does. The south pasture went green almost overnight, the way Montana spring arrives when it finally decides to arrive. Not tentatively, but completely, as if making up for the delay all at once. The cattle came back to the north pasture and found the fence intact, and the trough running, and the grass beginning to push through the burned ground, thin but real, the land doing what land does when given the chance. Noah turned 3 in the first week of May. There was no ceremony planned. Margaret had not grown up in a household that made much of birthdays, and Elias had spent the last 2 years in the kind of moving, uncertain existence where birthdays got acknowledged quietly, if at all. But the morning of Noah's birthday, Margaret came into the kitchen before first light and made a thing she had not made since she was young, a pancake with dried apple in it, the kind her mother had made for her, slightly sweet and not quite right by any professional standard, but real in the way of things made by hand with available ingredients and the specific intention of making something good for someone. She had it on the table when Noah came out. He stood in the doorway in his sleep clothes looking at the table with that careful inventory he always did. He saw the cake. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the cake again. Is that for me? He said. It's for your birthday, she said. He came to the table and stood beside it and looked at it with the seriousness he brought to anything that mattered. I'm 3, he informed her. I know, she said. 3 is significant. He looked up at her. What's significant? It means it counts for a lot. He seemed satisfied with this. He climbed into his chair and looked at the cake and then at her and said, Can I have some now? You can have some now, she said, and cut him a piece. He ate it with total concentration, the way he ate things he was serious about, and halfway through he looked up and said, This is the best thing I ever ate, which was extravagant but delivered with such conviction that she chose to believe he meant it. Elias came in from the early chores and stopped in the kitchen doorway, and looked at his son eating cake at the table and looked at Margaret at the stove, and stood there for a moment with an expression she could not have described, but recognized as belonging to the category of things that don't need to be spoken to be understood. He sat down. She cut him a piece without being asked. The south fence is clear, he said, after a moment. Good. The roan calf's walking better. Whatever was wrong with that leg seems to have sorted itself. I thought it would. He ate the cake. This is good, he said. Don't be surprised, she said. I can cook. I know you can cook. I've been eating your cooking for 4 months. Then don't look surprised. He wasn't looking surprised. He was looking at her with something that was past the early uncertainty, past the careful navigation of the first weeks. Something settled. She saw it and looked away, and then looked back because there was no longer a reason to look away from things that were simply true. After breakfast, Noah asked if they could all go brush the horses together, and they did. the three of them in the barn, with the spring light coming through the gaps in the new boards. And Noah stood between them and worked on Belle's flank with the brush and told the horse in great detail about being three and significant. And the horse listened with the courtesy of horses who have decided someone is acceptable. And Margaret stood with her arm resting on the stall post and thought, "This is not what I planned. Not any of it. Not the fire, not the fence, not the stone on the shelf, not a 2-year-old arriving hungry on a winter night and changing the temperature of a kitchen she thought she'd made peace with being cold. She had not planned any of it, and she was beginning to understand that the best things she had ever had were the things she hadn't planned, the things that had arrived unbidden and required her to decide, in the moment, whether she had enough left to make room for them. She had. She did. That surprised her still, a little. She thought it probably always would. The letter from Pete Garner arrived in June. It was not from him directly. It was from a lawyer in Bozeman, formal and careful, informing Margaret Hale that Mr. Garner was resigning his position on the board of the Larimer Valley Lending Company, effective immediately, and that any outstanding business matters between his holdings and the Hale property were considered closed. She read it at the kitchen table while Elias was out on the south pasture and Noah was asleep for his afternoon rest. She read it twice and then set it down and sat with it for a while. Closed, that was the word. A man who had spent years engineering her failure. Not from hatred, not from any feeling about her personally at all. Just from the cold calculation that her land was worth having and her circumstances could be made to make it available. And now he was sending a lawyer's letter to say it was closed, as if that were the natural end of the story rather than the conclusion he'd been backed into. She didn't feel triumphant. She had expected to when she imagined this moment during the weeks when it was still uncertain. She had thought she would feel something large and vindicating. Instead, she felt tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has set it down and now is simply tired, without the weight, the absence not yet comfortable but no longer active. She put the letter in the document chest with the territorial authorities' review and the corrected loan papers. She closed the chest. She went back to work. Summer on the Larimer Valley Ranch was a different country from winter, and Margaret had always known this intellectually, had lived the contrast enough times that it should not have surprised her. But this summer felt different in a way that had nothing to do with the season itself. The work was the same, the fence maintenance, the water management in the dry stretches, the cattle rotation, the 1,000 small decisions of running a piece of land that doesn't care whether you're ready for it. None of that changed. What changed was that she was not doing it alone. Not just in the practical sense of having another pair of hands. That was real and significant. The things that had taken her twice as long by herself moved at a reasonable pace when there were two of them, and some of the things she had simply stopped doing because they required two people could be done now. But the practical dimension of it was not the thing she thought about when she lay awake in the summer dark listening to the windmill. She thought about the quality of the evenings. The way dinner was a conversation rather than a task. The way the silence after Noah went to sleep had a presence in it rather than an absence. The way she woke in the mornings with the sense of things to move toward rather than things to endure. She had not understood, when she was in the deepest part of her solitude, that solitude had weight. She had thought she was managing. She had told herself daily that she was managing, and she was not wrong. She had managed. She had kept the property running. She had not fallen apart. But management is not the same as living, and she had been confusing the two for long enough that she had stopped noticing the confusion. She was noticing it now. On a Tuesday evening in late July, sitting on the porch after dinner while Elias was inside finishing the dishes, and Noah was somewhere in the yard conducting a private investigation of a beetle. He'd found near the water trough. Elias came out and sat in the other chair and said nothing for a while. The evening was warm in the way summer evenings in Montana earn their warmth. Legitimately, having actually gotten warm rather than merely less cold. The light was long, the mountains visible all the way to their highest points for the first time since winter. "I want to ask you something," Elias said. She looked at him. He was looking out at the yard, at Noah crouching near the trough, at the windmill. "All right," she said. "Not as a negotiation," he said. "Not about the property or the money or any of the practical arrangements." He paused. "Just as what it is." She waited. "I want to marry you," he said. "If you're willing. When you're willing, I'm not setting a time." He kept his eyes forward. I know it's not the same situation as 12 years ago. I know I'm not asking the same question. I know you might not want the formality of it, and I meant what I said. I'm staying regardless. But if it ever matters to you, for whatever reason, he stopped, started again. I want you to know that what I feel isn't practical. It isn't about the land or the arrangement. It's... He paused once more, and she could see him choosing words carefully, a man who was not accustomed to this kind of articulation and was doing it anyway, which told her more than the words themselves. It's you, he said. That's the whole of what I can say. It's you. The windmill turned. Noah said something to the beetle that she couldn't make out. She looked at the mountains. She thought about this girl she had been at 19, who had loved Elias Mercer with the terrifying completeness of someone who didn't yet know that the world could reach into the space between two people and rearrange everything. She thought about the years after, the grief she'd never been allowed to properly process because it had been premised on a lie, the slow, hard construction of a life from the materials available, the particular loneliness of a woman in a territory that had no language for the kind of loss she'd had. She thought about a door opening on a winter night without a knock, a child saying hungry with the last of his energy, a stone with a white vein through it on her kitchen shelf. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known at 19. That love is not a feeling that arrives fully formed and sustains itself on its own. That it is built the way fences are built, post by post, wire by wire, in all weather, by people who show up to do the work even when the work is hard. That it is not proved in the grand moments but in the ordinary ones. The coffee put within reach rather than into the hand, the door hinge fixed without an announcement, the child's blanket adjusted in the dark. She thought about all of that, and then she stopped thinking about it. Not yet, she said. But yes. He turned to look at her. Not yet because I'm not ready for the formal part, she said. But yes, because... She stopped and looked at him directly, and let him see whatever was in her face without managing it. Because I stopped wanting you to leave sometime around the 3rd week of December, and that hasn't changed. He held her gaze for a long moment. All right, he said. Not yet, but yes. Yes, she confirmed. Noah appeared at the porch steps holding something cupped in both hands. It flew away, he announced, with the philosophical tone of a person who has made peace with an outcome. He looked at his hands, then at them. Then he climbed the steps and came and stood between their chairs and leaned against Margaret's arm in the way he had been doing since the night on the riverbank, the comfortable lean of someone who has found a place they fit. She put her arm around him. He leaned in further and closed his eyes, not quite asleep, not quite awake, suspended in the particular peace of a child who is exactly where he needs to be. Elias watched this from the other chair, and his face held the look she had learned to recognize, the one that lived in the territory past relief, past gratitude, somewhere in the country of things that don't have names because they don't need them. The three of them sat on the porch in the long summer light, and the windmill turned and the mountains held their shape against the evening sky, and nothing dramatic happened, which was its own kind of answer to all the dramatic things that had brought them here. Years passed the way years pass when life has finally found its structure. Not effortlessly, not without grief and setback, and the ordinary failures of ordinary days, but with the underlying steadiness of people who have decided what they are to each other and don't need to keep deciding it. Elias and Margaret married in the second autumn after the fire, a small thing at the county clerk's office with Cass and Ruth Brennan as witnesses and Noah in the good shirt Margaret had made him, which he wore with an air of great personal dignity. No ceremony beyond the signatures, no party afterward, though Ruth brought food to the house that evening and insisted on staying long enough to eat it together. The Larimer Valley Lending Company was restructured under territorial authority oversight 2 years after Margaret's complaint, the investigation having uncovered the same conflict of interest pattern across 4 other properties in the valley. 2 of those families got loan corrections. 1 had already lost their land, and that story was its own kind of ending that the territorial authorities' letters could not fully address. Pete Garner left the valley. Nobody spoke of him much after that, not from forgiveness, but because he no longer took up space in the daily calculations of people who had survived him. The North Barn was rebuilt properly in the 3rd year, larger than the original. Elias designed it. The valley's men built it. Margaret fed all of them for 3 days and considered it a reasonable exchange. The ranch prospered in the way that working land prospers when it is well managed and given time. Not spectacularly, not beyond what the land and the seasons could honestly produce, but solidly. Enough, more than enough, in the years when the weather was kind, and survivable in the years when it wasn't. That was all they had ever wanted from it, enough and survivable, and the occasional year of genuine abundance that allowed them to repair things that had needed repairing for too long. Noah grew the way children grow on working land, practical and observant and comfortable with labor in the way you only become when it's been part of your life since before you can remember. He had his father's steadiness and something of his mother Clara's look around the eyes, as Elias had said, and something else that was entirely his own, a quality of attention, a way of noticing things before they needed to be noticed, that was not quite either of his parents and was therefore completely his. He learned to read sitting at the kitchen table with Margaret, a thing that took 2 winters and considerable mutual frustration and resulted, eventually, in a boy who read anything he could find with the focused appetite of someone who had discovered a country that had always existed and only recently been made available to him. He never called her anything other than Mama. Not because he'd been told to, not because he'd forgotten his mother Clara. Elias had made sure he knew his mother's name and something of who she was, told him in the way of a father who understands that a child's story is made of all the people who shaped it, not just the ones still present. He called her Mama because that was what she was. And because at 2 years old on a winter night he had understood something that it would take the adults much longer to work out. That family is not the people you were assigned, but the people who open the door. She had opened the door. Not all the way. Not gracefully. With one hand on the cast iron pan and 12 years of grief compressed into a 31-year-old woman's very steady voice, telling an exhausted man to explain himself. But she had opened it. Margaret herself, in the later years, thought about that a great deal. About the night he'd come back and what she might have done differently if she'd been harder or more certain or better defended. She had almost sent him away. She had been fully prepared to. Everything she had built in 12 years of solitude and survival had been built partly to protect herself from precisely this, from opening a door she had thought was closed for good. And she thought, what if she had? What if she had kept the door shut and sent him out into the cold and never known about the letters, or her aunt's certainty, or the 12 years of misunderstood silence? She would have had the ranch. She would have had the property. The corrected loan would never have been filed. Garner would eventually have gotten his way by attrition, and she would have spent the rest of her years contracting slowly around the available space. She thought about that, and she felt something she could not quite name. Not relief exactly, because relief implies you know you were in danger, and she hadn't known she was in danger the way a person who almost steps in front of a horse doesn't know until after. She had thought she was fine. She had been quite sure she was fine. She had been surviving. It turned out surviving and fine were not the same thing, and it took a man with no right to be at her door and a 2-year-old with dark curls and a hunger that was about more than food to show her the difference. What she thought, in the end, was this: that the instinct to protect yourself from what has hurt you before is not wrong. It kept her upright through years that would have leveled someone less determined. But there is a point at which the protection becomes the wound, when the wall you built to keep the hurt out also keeps everything else out. And you stop noticing the difference between safety and emptiness because you've been in one place so long. What she had needed was not a reason to believe in people again. She had never entirely stopped. What she had needed was a reason to stop treating every open door as a potential trap, and the reason had arrived in the least manageable way possible, hungry and exhausted and too small to be anything other than exactly what he was. She had not forgiven her aunt easily. She was not sure even years later that forgiven was the right word. She understood her, which was different and colder in some ways, and the understanding was its own kind of peace, not the warm kind, but the kind that lets you set something down without requiring it to be resolved. She had not gotten her 12 years back. Nobody gets those back. They existed as a shape in her life, the years between 19 and 31, a decade of a different story than the one she would have chosen. She carried them. They were hers. She did not think they were wasted. You cannot waste years you actually lived through, even the hard ones, because they made you exactly the person you were when the next thing arrived. And sometimes the next thing needs you to be exactly that person and no one else. On the Montana frontier, where the winters were still hard, and the land still did not care about your plans, She had learned that survival was not won by strength alone. Everyone said that, and most of them meant it as comfort. What she understood it to mean, in the specific concrete terms of her actual life, was this: that the strongest thing she had ever done was not fixing the windmill or managing the debt or filing the territorial complaint, though she had done all of those and they had mattered. The strongest thing was putting the arm around a child who had not asked, on a riverbank in the dark while the valley burned, because he was there and she was there, and he was cold and she was warm, and that was the whole of what the moment required. Everything else had grown from that. The way things grow from small acts done without calculation. Not heroically, not with full knowledge of what they mean, just one human being recognizing another and making room. That was enough. It turned out it always had been. The windmill still turned. The stone with the white vein through it stayed on the shelf above the stove until the shelf itself was replaced 10 years later, at which point Noah, who was 12 and paying attention, moved it to the new shelf before anyone asked him to. It stayed there. It would stay there after them, through other winters and other fires and other people who would someday stand in that kitchen and not know its story, which was fine, which was how most good things work. They outlast the telling and go on being true anyway.